you all doing? It's a good morning so far, good week, long week, right? Lots of in-depth knowledge on lots of topics. Not so much social science yet, so we're going to shift gears here this morning and talk a bit about the social science perspective. So can I just get a sense of how many natural scientists there are in the room? Okay, and how many other people are there of other types? Okay, great, good, thank you. Very helpful. Okay, so let me introduce what we're going to talk about this way. That I just heard you discussing this as a goal, less CO2 in the atmosphere, right? And if I asked you all to propose mechanisms, just draw a little causal map of how to produce that outcome, you could do that in physical, scientific ways. So you might say CCS is a great device for doing that. What we've got to do is find the carbon, inject it into the locations, and make sure that it stays there. But if you just stop your recommendations at that point, then you overlook two very important aspects of the process, which are A, you need the money to pay for doing it, and B, you need people to be willing to do it. Even if there is money, they may want to spend the money on something else instead. And if there isn't money, you need people to be able to create that money. And you might say, oh, come on. It's obvious we need this. There's no dispute here. There's a critical mass of people who agree. That's why there's so much scholarly work being done on this. That's why there's so much creative thinking being done by scientists about how to accomplish creative solutions. But the reality is, if you look at Washington the last few years, there are a number of things that could have happened policy-wise that didn't. And I want to suggest to you that one of the reasons why is a misunderstanding about the social and psychological aspects of this issue that are impeding what you might think of as scientific progress. So if I were to draw a picture of what could produce this goal, my picture would look like this, and you'll see that it has almost no natural science in it at all. So here I'm proposing the idea that there could be less CO2 in the atmosphere in the future if we reduce emissions and if we create something like a giant vacuum cleaner to suck out what's up there already. And you could imagine somebody's got to invent that vacuum cleaner, so that's a process for natural scientists. But from here on back in the model, this is all people, this is thinking, this is politics and the public. And to understand how the public influences politics and how politics influences the unveiling and development and implementation of natural science processes, you got to understand these kinds of processes. Now, fortunately, the good news is social scientists have been studying these kinds of things for at least 60 years in quantitative, statistical, sophisticated ways. And we understand how the public doesn't think about these things, and we understand how the public does think about these things. And I'm going to give you a very, very quick tour just to give you a sense of some of the misunderstandings and some of the realities. And by the way, of course, the point of all this is to tell you there are people like me at Stanford and elsewhere around the country and the world studying exactly these issues, and this is work you could get involved in, or at least you probably want to know about. So here's a quote from the Pew Center on Global Climate Change some years ago, where they said the public has not really understood the issue of climate change very well, nor have they understood the role they play in greenhouse gas emissions. We need a major effort to educate the public. So after a number of years go by, a major effort from them and others. Here's what we heard in November 2010 from Bloomberg Businessweek. The number of Americans who agree the Earth is warming because of man-made activity has been in free fall. That's a dramatic statement. And in fact, that captures what I believe to be the perception in Washington right now. And that perception matters. It matters both in terms of the energy that legislators can put behind passing pieces of legislation that President Obama promised to pass, but also it affects what the candidates say as they campaign for President of the United States preparing for the 2012 election. If you listen to, for example, Rick Perry has apparently read or heard about this work because he has concluded that he has nothing to lose by coming out very much on the skeptical side of this issue. He said recently that the scientists who study climate change are mainly fabricating their data in order to get research money to support their work. That's a pretty amazing statement from somebody who could be elected President of the United States. But it comes from a survey, actually. It almost exactly parallels the wording of a question in a survey. So he might say, ha, 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 I'm reading the surveys, I'm seeing what's going on, I know how to express, honestly, my point of view in a way that will resonate with the American public. But here's the tricky thing. Here's what the survey question says. Do you think scientists have fabricated their data studying climate change in order to get more research money? And 60-something% of Americans said yes. What's ambiguous about that question wording? Which scientists? Right? It could be the mainstream scientists who conclude, as the IPCC reports do, that climate change is real and a problem. But couldn't it also be that people are referring to the relatively small group of skeptical scientists? The question is written in a way that is ambiguous about that. So therefore, it can be misinterpreted. Maybe it's true that the vast majority of people think the skeptical scientists are the corrupt ones. Can't tell. Okay, so let's talk about what does the public really believe and how do we know it. The way we know it is we conduct national surveys, and I'm excited to tell you, I'm going to share with you this morning, for the first time, brand new results we got yesterday in a new survey, the first one we've done since 2010. But the problem is you can't actually, after this, leave the room until Reuters releases the results. So I apologize for that, but you have to stay. So don't tell your friends. We'll try to keep this under control. So the national surveys that we have done in the past have gone through 2010. Today is going to be the release of the 2011 results. These are all national telephone surveys with representative samples of Americans who are interviewed in what's called a random digit dial design of landlines and cell phones. Everybody has an equal probability of being interviewed. We train the interviewers carefully and supervise them closely and write questions carefully to be balanced and unbiased. Here's the wording of one of our questions that we've been asking for quite some time. It says, you may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What's your personal opinion on this? Do you think this has probably been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? So you can see it's a balanced question in that it offers both points of view explicitly, and it presents the idea as a hypothesis, not necessarily as a definitive idea. And we have tested whether this wording produces different results from removing the first sentence completely. What's your personal opinion? Do you think the world's temperature has been going up gradually over the past 100 years, or do you think it hasn't? And you get no difference in results. So let me show you what these numbers have looked like over time. When we first did this in 1997, 79% of Americans said they thought the Earth's temperature probably was going up. That number peaked at 85% in 2006. It now stands at 83% in our latest survey. So what you see is a little down and then a back up again. Now, you might wonder, why would the little down happen and why would the back up happen? And I'll tell you about that a little bit later. But the key point here is these are huge numbers, huge majorities on this side of this issue. Second, and by the way, no sign of a free fall in here at all. When we ask people, how sure are you that climate change has been happening? The top 2 points, extremely and very sure on our rating scale, 44% of people said so back in 1997. Today, that number is the highest it has ever been at 53%. So there was an increase, a statistically significant increase from last year to today. So this issue has definitely been under discussion, and it definitely has been increasing people's engagement in it and increasing their confidence in their views. I will tell you, this increase in certainty is mostly concentrated among the small group of people, among the 20% of people, the 17% of people who do not say this, who are skeptical. So in other words, the skeptical people in the last year have become a lot more sure of their skepticism. But on the other hand, the not skeptical people have grown in numbers, and they also have increased in their certainty. When we ask people whether they think climate change has been caused by human activity, natural processes, or the two about equally, back in 2006, when we first asked this, 80% of people said they thought it was due to human activity. That number stands at 72% today. So there has been a little bit of a decline over this time period, a little bit of up and down in that number, but again, a huge percentage. When we ask people, do you think a 5-degree Fahrenheit increase in average world temperature over 75 years would be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? A majority has always been on the bad side, not a huge majority. And so that raises an interesting question about why are people not troubled by this increase. So in other words, let's just stop there for a second. What you can see already, if you're a problem solver and you want to say, my agenda here is to increase public support for legislation and scientific research on climate change, then if you're looking for things that the public needs education about, it's not the stuff we've talked about so far. Huge numbers of people think climate change has been happening. Huge numbers think it's due to human activity. But here's the first case where still it's a majority, but it's not a gigantic majority, where you might say, well, what do we need to educate people about there? And of course, you know, this is maybe one of the most challenging problems, right? Is that if you ask a natural scientist, so what is the effect of climate change going to be 100 years from now? They say, well, we have predictive models. Different people have different models. So that's when predicting the future happens. It becomes harder to reach consensus about specifics. So that then becomes a tougher educational task. I'll show you one last one here, which is the proportion of people who said the federal government should do more to deal with this problem. That number was a little less than 50% in the 1990s. It is now, as of last year, a little more than 60%. Okay, so since I have 5 minutes left, I'm going to shift gears to the end of this little story. What I want to tell you about is our latest work, which is also going to be released, I hope, this week, on the impact of climate change on voting. So one potential argument here is to say, you know what, there are lots of issues, especially the economy and unemployment, that are focusing Americans' attention. That's leading them to think about presidential candidates in particular ways now. It will lead them to think about those candidates in the same way on election day. There's no way you're going to get climate change on people's radar screen. There is no way that what the candidates say about climate change is going to influence the outcome of this election. Well, that's one argument. There's another argument, which goes as follows, that the vast majority of Americans are not going to pay attention to climate change, as is true for every other policy issue. So as it turns out, when people vote, they're voting based on lots of considerations: perceptions of the candidates' personalities, their approval of the incumbent's performance in office, the state of the economy. But it turns out people's votes are also influenced by a small handful of policy issues. There are some people who care deeply about gun control laws, and they vote based on that. There are some people who care deeply about abortion, and they vote based on that. And there are about 15% of Americans who say they care deeply about climate change. And lots of research in political science suggests they will vote based on that issue. That 15% of people stands to be won over by a candidate if they explicitly take a position that matches their own. Now, as it turns out, the vast, vast majority of those people, more than 90% of those people, are on what you might call the green side of this issue. So what that says is, among the people who will vote based on it, they would much prefer a green candidate than a skeptical candidate. But that's an assertion in principle. We've now done 3 studies to look at whether that's true in practice. One of the studies that we did was to analyze everything every candidate running for the House and Senate in 2010 said on their websites about climate change. Some candidates said nothing, some candidates took a green position, and some candidates took what you might call a not green position, a skeptical position. And then we related what did they say on their website about climate change to whether they won their race or not. And I'm going to show you very quickly. So the percent of Democrats who won their race. If the Democrat took a green position and the Republican said nothing, 69% of the Democrats won. If the Democrat took a green position and the Republican took a not green position, that number didn't change at all. The Republican going not green didn't change it. But look at this. When both the Democrat and the Republican took green positions, in other words, they said the same thing, the impact of this issue went away. That the Democrats no longer gained by their green position because the 2 candidates were the same. And most importantly, look at this. When both candidates said nothing, the Democrats won 17% of the time. So you can think about the contrast between this and this, where the Republican stays silent, but the Democrat switches from silent to green. Look at that huge gain in percentages of victory. And the reason is because this is in places where there were very close races and there was a potential gain. So the other 2 methodologies that we used were embedded in surveys. We did in a telephone survey where we described hypothetical candidates to respondents in different ways. Sometimes we described the candidate as green, sometimes not green, sometimes silent. And we asked the respondents how likely they were to vote for the candidate, and we saw the same kinds of effects. When that hypothetical candidate took a green position, voters then were more likely to say they would vote for that person. And when we analyzed data from the 2008 US presidential election, we saw exactly the pattern of effects that we expected. That is, candidates were much more likely to vote, voters were much more likely to vote for the candidate who was closer to them, who they perceived to be closer to them on climate change-related policy issues. Most people, most Americans saw Barack Obama to be closer, and so that contributed to his victory. So that gives you a quick overview of our research and a feel for how we go about some of it. We do lots of other kinds of work. We do experiments showing people videos and looking at the impact of those videos. One of the hypotheses we're thinking about now might interest you. You know that there are lots of natural scientists who are interested in disseminating their findings to the public. And there are some natural scientists who think it's important to, thank you. By the way, many years as a classical percussionist, so that's a nice sound. So some of these scientists are interested in stepping beyond their scientific statements and making statements about desirable directions for public policy. So sometimes you will see those climate experts telling government what government ought to do. And the question we're exploring is whether that actually might undercut the trustworthiness of those natural scientists, because they're apparently willing to offer opinions that go outside of their area of expertise into a domain in which they may not have so much expertise of politics. So that gives you a feel for one of the many other studies that we have going. Thank you for this time and that nice reminder. And let me just see, is Liz Quinlan here? Liz is not here, so let's do questions if you would like.
Do you see the president of the campaigning as a way of educating the public? And if so, is it our obligation to then go to Rick Perry with this data, try and change his mind so that he can therefore educate the public in the same thing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So is a presidential campaign an opportunity to educate Americans on an issue? Well, absolutely. So one way of thinking about a campaign and what results from it is that Americans are deciding who do they trust. So most people hadn't even heard of Rick Perry before this process started. And as a matter of fact, most Americans still haven't heard of Rick Perry. But they might someday soon. And in that process, if right now Republicans and politics watchers are watching these candidates very carefully so that they can think about who to nominate for their party, that once some resolution comes out of this process, where there clearly are differences among the Republican candidates in their positions on this issue, Americans will decide who among that group is most credible, who presents the arguments in the most convincing way, who seems to have the most basis for expertise and to express those opinions. And so you might say that the key time to intervene is before that happens, before the big debates, before the nominated candidate really takes a position. And you need to go to that candidate and say, look, this is what the public thinks. Now, here's the weird thing for me. There is every reason that they should know this stuff already. I mean, we put this out publicly. This election stuff is out publicly. It's been in the news media. Their consultants know about this work. But their consultants, for some reason, there is a perception, I think a misperception in Washington, that public opinion is not where these data suggest it is. And the reason is because there's some other polls that get misinterpreted in ways that seem to suggest different results. And in fact, if I showed you a slide, which I don't have, where we array all of the different survey results from lots of different organizations, seemingly sort of asking kind of the same question about is climate change a problem or not, you can see everything from 85% of people saying it is to 42% of people saying it is. In order to make sense of that, you have to spend time looking at the question wordings and decide what you trust, and also decide whether you trust the methods used to collect the data. That's a level of sophistication you would think the campaign consultants would have. But for some reason, I think the message may be breaking down. Now, on the other hand, if Rick Perry definitely thinks, he says, look, I don't care what the public thinks. In fact, I know what the public thinks. My personal view is this is a hoax. And I'm going to say it because that's who I am, and I want America to elect me because this is what I think. I plan to convince them of that. Then, it's not clear that we can. But I think you're certainly right, and it's my goal to disseminate this work as much as possible so that people do with it what they wish.
Why
do you suspect that Democrats do worse when the Republicans take a non-green position and they don't say anything?
Yeah, well, so that's an interesting question. I suspect that the non-green arguments, well, see, can I show you this? I guess, can I do this? Maybe I can't. The non-green arguments, when they are made in a particularly compelling way, like, look, we're in an economic crisis right now. We can't afford to do anything that's going to cost money. These solutions like cap and trade and others are going to increase prices. What we really should be doing is spending our money on the cheapest domestic sources of energy: coal, oil, natural gas. We have a lot of it here in the United States. We should just do this. That by itself, that argument has appeal. If it didn't have appeal by itself, they would never have been making it. And so in the absence of the counter-argument on the green side, it has some appeal. And then I think those voters in those districts who only hear the skeptical message from the Republican and nothing from the Democrat can honestly say, why is the Democrats not saying anything? Well, maybe because the Republicans are right. So that would be my guess.
Given people's tendency to conflate this year's weather with climate change in general, well, have you addressed that in your research?
Yeah, great question.
It's hot this year, or it's not hot this year, therefore climate change comes on.
Exactly. Okay. So there are two ideas on this. One is that the temperature at the moment I interview you influences your answer. There is some psychological research showing that if you bring people into a waiting area out in the lobby where it's 70 degrees, and then you bring them into this room to fill out a questionnaire, and it's 65 degrees in here or it's 80 degrees in here, more people say climate change is happening in the 80-degree room than in the 65-degree room. Honestly, I'm a little skeptical about this myself, because we've never seen this. What we've seen in our surveys is it doesn't matter what time of year you do the survey. If you do it in the middle of winter, you do it in the middle of summer, you do it in the fall, we get the same results. So it does not, now admittedly, there's a limit. There, this experiment I told you about is college students who are participating in a psych experiment, so who knows how much you can generalize that, but that's the, there is some evidence suggesting temperature at the moment matters. Our work does not suggest that. However, this down and up here, I believe, is due to exactly what you're saying in a bigger way. And we've shown this with our data. It turns out that you can divide the American public into about 70% of people who trust what climate scientists say, and about 30% of people who are skeptical about climate science. Even among that 30%, lots of them think that climate change is happening. But the way they get to that judgment is not by what the scientists tell them. It's because they look at average world temperatures over a period of years, and they watch it going up. Guess what happened in 2008? Average world temperature went down. Not a lot, but it did go down. So those people who are very attentive to this showed us in our survey that they knew it, given the questions that we asked. And that drove their beliefs to go down. That's what caused this little dip. It's gotten warmer again worldwide. That's what's causing this number to go up again. So, yeah.
Slide about the Democratic victory one. Is it slightly simplistic to say that you're just comparing the green versus non-green issue? I mean,
isn't there a lot of other stuff that influences the election outcome? Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm not showing you is the very high-tech multinomial logistic regression equation that we estimated that show that all these effects are real when you control for lots of other variables. So you control for whether the Democrat was an incumbent running for re-election or not. You control for whether the Republican was an incumbent running for re-election or not. You control for the percent of people living in the area who voted for Barack Obama in 2008. So you can pick up a kind of inclination toward Republican Democrat. And we control for region of the country, various other things as well. So your point is absolutely valid, and that's why any one study is never definitive. That you incorporate the controls, but especially here, it's not a true experiment. And so what we complement this with are the experiments that we do in other surveys. I see something in the back. Okay, let's go all the way to the back. Sorry, so Ann.
Do you think at all about natural selection bias, the fact that you're proposing a survey on climate change, and so someone who may have a different opinion may not participate in the survey?
Okay, so I went a little too quickly over the beginning. I skipped a little bullet for you on this point. When we call people, we do not tell them this is a survey about climate change. We say this is survey about public issues. And what I showed you without telling you is that our co-sponsors for these surveys are typically well-known news media organizations like ABC News, Time Magazine, Washington Post, and so on. So when we call people, we say, hi, calling from the Associated Press to do, the survey we did last week is with Reuters. So it's a general survey, and it begins on other topics and then eventually gets into climate change stuff. So we don't have a group of people who are interested in or passionate about climate change. And we find essentially the same results from these questions, whether we ask them in a survey with lots of climate change questions, or if we just put one climate change question on somebody else's survey with lots of other questions before it. So that doesn't seem to be a source of bias.
Sorry, so that question, do you vary the questions about the same thing in all these? You mentioned that there's another survey, so that 42% agree with or disagree with climate change. So logic would say if you have 3 or 4 questions that ask the same thing, what's your option to make a word?
Yeah. So part of my research program for the last 30 years has been to design survey questions to measure what people think accurately. And by reviewing a huge literature that's out there, but there is no book yet called the Handbook of Questionnaire Design. We're writing it now. And so there aren't exactly clear guidelines in public, but for us, there are a set of principles that come from this literature. We write our questions to conform to those principles. We have looked at, in our own studies, if we ask the Gallup question in our survey, do we get the same results Gallup does? And we do. If we ask the Pew question in our survey, do we get the same results? We get the same results. So it's clearly what's explaining the differences is not hocus pocus. It's the question wording that matters. And so what you can do is then look at those question wordings and decide which of those really is asking what you'd like it to be asking. And that's what we do.
Do you find there's a demographic which doesn't ever respond to your surveys or respond very rarely?
Yes, there is a very, very reliable relationship of demographics to participation in all surveys. So men participate less than women. Low-income people participate less than high-income people. Low-education people participate less than high-education people. Racial minorities, African Americans in particular, participate less than whites. Fortunately, there's a very nice solution to this problem. It's called statistical weighting, W-E-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, where what we do is, essentially, if we have too many women and not enough men, we undercount the women and overcount the men in a sophisticated way to balance out the sample and produce what we know to be the truth from the Census Bureau about the balance of men and women in the population. Now that way, it's not like it should be equal numbers and it's like this. There's a slight overrepresentation of women and a slight underrepresentation of men. And when we do the weighting and balance it out, it very rarely changes the survey results much. But we do it because we want to make sure. And there are some cases where it makes a huge difference. So for example, in the 2008 election, African American turnout was unusually high, and African Americans almost always vote more than 90% for the Democratic candidate for president. So if you underrepresent that group by half, so instead of 11%, you've got 5%, that makes a big difference in that circumstance. And so you always want to do this.
So one other question. What about age demographics?
Younger people participate in surveys less than older people do, and so we correct for that as well.
I saw the spike in 2006, and I immediately thought of that's when the Inconvenient Truth came out. What's your opinion on that work by Al Gore and how it affected public opinion?
Lovely idea. It's a nice movie. How many people saw the movie? Okay. So turns out a tiny fraction of Americans saw that movie. You can look up ticket sales and DVD sales. And so the first problem is hardly anybody saw it. Second problem is most of the people who saw it already agreed with everything it was saying in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean that it had no impact on them. It's absolutely possible that that exposure solidified people's confidence in their own points of view, energized them to become more active on the issue than they would have been. Absolutely possible. And that may well be partly what's going on in that small group of people who care a lot about the issue. But it's unlikely to have produced a big change nationally.